Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided. This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome. We're back with Access to Democracy. I'm Alan Miller, and with us is Teresa Nelson, better known as Terry, who is counsel to the ACLU of Minnesota. And I want to welcome her back on the show and say hello to everybody from NSA who's listening in on this performance, and other government agencies that are intruding into our space and our time. And let's talk about that. Even yesterday, we found out that the NSA listening program is even more extensive than we thought it was. What is happening to our privacy?
Well, we're very troubled by what's happening to our privacy, and that's right. Just yesterday, the New York Times revealed that the NSA was reviewing communications, email communications, text communications that we Americans have with people overseas. And it's much broader than simply communications of targets of surveillance or target terrorism investigation targets. It is communications that might be about a target of an investigation. That's a much broader category of things, and so virtually all of our text communications overseas are being intercepted and reviewed by NSA, and that's very troubling.
I heard an interesting program last night talking about how they do it and how long they keep this material. They apparently have certain buzzwords, and these millions of different communications go through, and the computers pick out certain buzzwords, and if they do, they pull them up and then they scrutinize them. The problem is that, and I don't think anybody is troubled by the need to protect ourselves, but the question is how far intrusions can go. And I mean, we now have cell phones where people can trace where we are.
Yep.
Or law enforcement.
GPS, yep, absolutely.
We now have license plates that are being photographed by the millions, and all of this without warrants.
That's correct. And in terms of the text communications, my understanding is that what's happening is that the communications will be scrutinized on the front end for certain buzzwords, and that is probably better than simply collecting everything, but still, depending on what those searches are, you can scoop up a lot of irrelevant material, a lot of innocent conversations between individuals that the NSA really has no reason to collect. And it seems like there has been
no business to collect either. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like there's been a fundamental shift in law enforcement, that the notion that you are innocent until proven guilty has flipped to you are guilty until proven innocent. And so we have a need to scrutinize everything and sift through it, and on the front end, rather than saying we have individualized suspicion, we are going to collect information about Alan because we know that, or we have a strong belief that he's done something wrong. It's rather, we're just going to collect everything we know about Alan just in case he does something wrong in the future. And that's a fundamental shift.
I normally email friends in Israel, friends in Switzerland, so I know that my communications are being vetted or looked at, or whatever you would call it. And that's fine, because they're all social communications. But it's not fine in terms of the fact that just when I want to contact somebody overseas, Big Brother is sitting there. I mean, it's far beyond Big Brother. It's far beyond 1984 and George Orwell. It's now shifting the whole burden, as you said, to the innocent, and there's something very wrong with that.
It is, and I want to just call you out a little bit on saying, well, it's fine because it's just social communications. And that's what a lot of people think is, well, I don't have anything to hide, so this is okay. I don't mind if they go through my email to grandma. But it has caused a fundamental shift, and it, you know, privacy is an important aspect of living a dignified life. And so even though you might not have anything to hide in your social communications, the whole notion that they are being scrutinized and reviewed is troubling. And you may not know whether or not you really do have something to hide. You might not know if there's a code word that happens to be an ordinary word that all of a sudden triggers additional scrutiny by you. We know certainly that there are mistakes that are made in criminal justice investigations. People have been wrongfully convicted. There's an Innocence Project.
That's why we have an ACLU, but an ACLU
yes.
is limited in really what it can do. You generally come into the picture after something bad has happened.
That's right.
And not before.
That's right.
And it's good to be proactive, but you have to know what you're being proactive about.
Yep.
And that's a real problem now.
Yes, it is.
Just tell the viewers briefly what the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution says.
Sure. So the Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures without a warrant based on probable cause. And so there's a few things in there that are important. First of all, you have to show, where you have a reasonable expectation of privacy, the police government needs to have some individualized suspicion in order to interfere with that reasonable expectation of privacy. The Fourth Amendment does require warrants, although there have been exceptions to that warrant requirement. For example, if a police officer sees you on the street and suspects that you're up to illegal conduct, he can stop you. It's called a Terry stop.
What we used to call exigent circumstances.
Yep.
An emergency situation.
Yep, exactly. That's another exception to the warrant requirement. But in all those cases, the police still have to have individualized suspicion. And that's really the hallmark of the Fourth Amendment, is this requirement that you have individualized suspicion. And when you look at the reason for the Fourth Amendment and our early American history and the whole reason that we fought a Revolutionary War, one of the reasons was to oppose the King's general warrants, which were called writs of assistance, that basically gave broad authority to go in and search and seize anything, and we didn't like that. And so that was part of the reason that we crafted the Fourth Amendment.
And the fact of the matter is, we know that the Federal Surveillance Court will almost say yes to anything. I think in the
yes.
thousands of applications for warrants that have been presented to them, they have turned down 4, according to what I have been advised. So
yes.
It's not as though you can't get a warrant if you're a law enforcement officer, because they're practically, and all those judges have been appointed by Judge Roberts, so they are all pretty conservative, all 11
yes.
of them, and they don't turn down anything unless it's really, really outrageous, 4 times in thousands of cases.
Right. Well, and the problem is that you're talking about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court,
Yeah.
which was set up by a federal law, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which gives authorities a little bit broader authority when it comes to searches involving targets, foreign targets. And so the problem is the FISA Act has insufficient safeguards. It really does allow for broad spying, and much of the NSA data collection that we're hearing about now was done pursuant to these warrants. There was a warrant that basically said you can collect all subscriber records, all details about calls made using Verizon's network. So that included...
And those includes local calls
Yep.
within the country.
Yep, exactly.
That wasn't the intent originally.
No.
And even those out of the country, it should have been targeted to specific individuals
Yep.
that were on a hit list, so to speak, of terrorists, things like that. But it's gone far beyond that now to where
Exactly.
Now I'm told that the collection, if it doesn't show up anything, because the hard drives can only contain so much, that they wipe them every 3 days. I don't know that that's so.
In terms of the phone records or the cell phone call records, who you've called, when times of calls, duration, things like that, my understanding is that those are kept for many years, and the whole point of collecting all of these records of American phone calls is if they get a number, you know, at some point they can go back and look over many years. So the idea of that collection was, well, we don't know what we don't know, and so we want to keep this stuff. It'll make it easier for us to look back 5 years and see if this, you know, terrorist suspect called somebody here. The current revelation with the email or, you know, text communications, I believe you're right that they're saying is not kept beyond what they need to do.
In addition to that, we are now facing a drone society.
Yes,
it used
we
to
are.
be when they would say that I would drone on, change the subject a little bit. But no, now when you say drone, we're talking about things that are small enough, some as small as mosquitoes, I understand, that are hovering around and photographing everything. I mean, I know if I go online and I want to see what my house looks like, boom,
There it is.
there it is. You know, our privacy is really diminished to the point, to me, it's frightening. We don't know where these drones are. We don't know exactly what they're photographing. But that, again, is another really invasion.
It's a massive invasion, and it's not just the government. You know, drones could be created by your neighbor. I saw a YouTube video a little while ago of somebody who'd done a do-it-yourself drone that he'd set up with a paint gun. And it was just amazing how, you know, he was able to maneuver this drone and shoot paint at a scarecrow or a dummy, but private companies can implement these, or neighbors, or and there's very little regulation for them. The privacy threats that we face, of course, massive privacy threats from government, but we also face privacy threats from private companies, from private entities as well. With the, you mentioned license plate readers earlier, those are being deployed by police departments, but also by private companies all over the place.
All over.
Yeah.
And is there a reason to take a photo of your license plate? Not necessarily.
Not necessarily, no. Now, law enforcement would say, well, we don't know. We don't know what we don't know, and so we're going to collect all of this information, which can tell you a very detailed information about people, where they've gone, where their daily patterns, whose doctor they use, things like that. They want to keep that information just in case sometime in the future it might be useful to them. Meanwhile, they have all this detailed information, which
that's pretty frightening.
It is.
And our cell phones, which now can track us wherever we go. So that when we talk about privacy, when we talk about the Fourth Amendment, we're talking about something that apparently is archaic in the eyes of government, because they have circumvented it almost completely.
They have.
And another thing, an interesting case that the Supreme Court was involved in recently, Maryland versus King, where it involved DNA samples.
Yeah, Maryland versus King is especially troubling, and is another example of a massive government database. Maryland versus King upheld a state law that required people arrested for felonies to provide DNA samples. Now, these are people who are arrested. We have a presumption of innocence in this country, but they're required to provide a DNA sample, which is then folded into a national database that's run by the federal government with DNA samples in it. In the past, we've required probable cause, again, to collect that DNA. You might be arrested for felony money laundering. Has nothing to do with DNA.
In many cases, even if a person is not arrested, if they're just brought into a police station, they're taking DNA samples. And I mean, it's strange. That was a 5-4 decision, and it was written, the minority decision was written by Justice Scalia.
Yes.
You wouldn't expect him to be with the three witches of Eastwick in the dissent, but he was disturbed about that intrusion.
Yes, he was. And actually, Justice Scalia has authored a number of opinions that have been very protective of Fourth Amendment rights and this individualized suspicion. And so that, you know, it didn't surprise me that he was in that position. I always say civil liberties make strange bedfellows. People have a perception that the ACLU is very, very, you know, is just a front for the Democratic Party. That's not true. We're very nonpartisan, and many of these issues really cross party lines, and that's an example.
And let's just jump our state border and go into Wisconsin.
Sure.
They're having demonstrations every week.
Yes.
In the, I guess, the state capitol.
Yep, in the state capitol.
Now, people have been arrested for watching. They weren't participating. I think it would involve singing. They weren't the singers. They were doing nothing but observing, and they were arrested by the police for what? If we can't go into our state capitals, I mean, where do we draw the line?
Oh, that's a very good question. And it is troubling that they were arrested. They should not have been arrested. I understand now the state police have made a change that they're no longer going to be arresting spectators. But
they do this after the cat is out of the bag.
Yes,
after
exactly.
they have arrested a lot of.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it is an example of efforts that we see all the time to suppress dissent. And suppress people from exercising their rights.
We have people trying to take the vote away from minorities and the elderly by making it more difficult to vote and coming up with all these voter ID laws and things like that, which fortunately hasn't happened here. But it could under a change of administrations. And
it could.
People don't complain until they're caught. And then suddenly they get religion, so to speak.
Yeah,
and then we hear from them. But let's go to New York City.
Okay.
Under Mayor Bloomberg, he okayed the chief of police to initiate these stop and frisk situations.
Yes.
If a police officer, a member of law enforcement, thinks that you look suspicious, they have the right to stop and ask you what you're doing, where you're going, and or to frisk you. Where is the authority for that?
Well, again, I would say that there isn't authority. Now, under the Fourth Amendment, there is this authority to initiate what's called a Terry stop, which does require reasonable, articulable, individualized suspicion.
But it requires you to be there if it's a Terry stop.
Yes, Terry, so instead of I. But it requires more than just, you look shady, I'm going to stop and frisk you. You have to have an individualized reason for suspecting. You have to be able to articulate a reason for suspecting that that person has been engaged in unlawful activity.
And it also leads to racial profiling.
It does, I was just going to say.
And even in this state,
yep,
we have found what with racial profiling?
Well, we have found that there is quite a bit of racially biased policing going on. The ACLU nationwide actually just released a report about a month ago on arrests for marijuana possession. And even though marijuana usage is pretty much identical for across the board.
And it's becoming legalized in many places.
Right. Minorities are 10 or 11 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession in Minnesota than white people. And so there's, the answer might be explained by a number of reasons, but racially biased policing is most certainly a factor.
Well, when you consider that the minority population in Minnesota is very small, the fact that the arrests are so skewed toward
Right.
minorities would clearly indicate that what you look like could get you arrested.
Yes, absolutely. And Minnesota has one of the lowest incarceration rates in the country, but we have one of the highest racial disparities in our prison system. It's very shameful that we have this one of the highest disparities.
I have an Arab headdress that I got in Israel years ago, probably 20 years ago. I have been so tempted to wear it when I go through the TSA profiling to see, because I guarantee you I would be picked out, I would be strip searched, and I would really be rung through the ringer because I was wearing that headdress.
I would not be surprised to hear that, and I guess it would depend on whether or not you care about missing your flight. You know, we do hear stories a lot about people who say that they were randomly selected to be screened, and they've got a pretty strong sense that it was because of their race, or because you know, it's a woman who's wearing a hijab, a head covering, things like that. Yeah, it happens all the time.
Yeah, I was pulled out of a line in Barcelona. Plane was delayed, and these security people had nothing to do, so they went down and they pulled the Americans and the British out. They didn't touch the Spanish.
Okay, interesting.
And really had a very intrusive search. I thought the lady who searched me probably was going to start a relationship with me, but it didn't work out.
She didn't buy you dinner?
And, you know, of course, I was clean, but I was detained for almost an hour.
And things like that, you know, you had that experience. That was probably a one-time occurrence. Think about what it must be like to have that happen every time you go to the airport, every time you pass a police officer.
Wasn't it right here that we had 8 imams who were pulled off a plane?
Yes.
And missed their flights right here in good old Minnesota, which is one of the most liberal states and one of the most progressive states, but yet it happens here.
It does happen here. Yeah, it happens everywhere, and it really does impact on people's dignity.
How about Minnesota versus Henderson? We have somebody who sees paramedics and sheriffs, I think, doing something with a next-door neighbor.
Yep.
Decides to memorialize it by grabbing his camera or camcorder or whatever it was and photographing it. Wasn't near, was a distance away. What happened to Henderson?
Well, Mr. Henderson, and he's our client, we are representing him in his criminal case. He saw something interesting going on in his apartment. He was videotaping. He was approached by a paramedic who asked him to stop filming, and he declined that request. So the paramedic went over to the sheriff and asked the sheriff's deputy to stop him from filming. The sheriff's deputy came over, asked him what he was doing. He said he was filming. She asked him to stop. He said, "No, I'm not doing anything wrong." And she just took his camera right out of his hand, just took it away. And she said, you know, if I end up on YouTube, I'm going to be very upset. This is the sheriff's deputy says, I'm going to be upset if I end up on YouTube. And so she took the video camera. He asked when he could get it back. She told him he could call property the next day. When he did that to try and get his camera back, he was told that he was going to be charged with disorderly conduct and obstruction of justice. And so he is, those charges are still currently pending. The city attorney has refused to drop them. We have brought a motion to dismiss because we believe that violates his First Amendment rights. He was not, you know, obstruction requires something physical, some physical act that you're getting in the way of what police or ambulance workers are doing.
We were in Budapest once, and there is a rule that's in Hungarian that you have to have your ticket punched before you get on the train.
Okay.
But if you don't read Hungarian, you don't know this.
Yeah.
So we got off a train, and half a dozen officers came over, and what they tried to do was get a bribe of $10 a person from us.
Okay.
And I refused. So I had a camcorder at the time. I started taking pictures of them. And they tried to take it away from me, and we really fought.
Okay.
Ultimately, we were detained for an hour. They said they called the police. I don't think they called anybody. And I just said, we'll wait you out. I tried to, as a matter of fact, go to a dispatcher and call the American Embassy.
Okay.
And they took the phone out of my hand.
Oh, no.
It was, so I can appreciate to some degree what these people went through.
Absolutely.
Are going through on a
Yep.
daily basis. I mean, we have all these intrusions, including TSA, which I think the TSA inspections have gone far beyond what they were intended to do. But
They
there's
have.
one more case, and we don't have that much time. I wanted to talk about Jesus Mendoza.
Yes,
Jesus is a passenger in a car.
that's correct. Yep.
The driver was arrested.
Yes.
Tell us what happened to Jesus.
So we call it banking while brown. Jesus was a passenger in a car. They'd gone to the bank, and the driver was suspected of identity theft. She actually hadn't been arrested at that point, but police were called, and the police said to the driver, "Come with us. We want to talk to you about this investigation." Our client, Ms. Mendoza Sierra, got out of the vehicle because she was going to be late for work. She wasn't going to go to the police department. There was no reason to. She was stopped by a deputy from Sibley County saying, "Hold on, go sit down. I need to talk to you." And initially, this deputy thought, well, maybe she's the person that is suspected. The police officer running the investigation said, "No, I just want the driver."
And
Nevertheless,
ultimately, they held her. They took her to her home.
Yep.
And she was a passenger. She had nothing to do with any of the action that was taking place. They took her to her home and searched through her personal material.
That's
Has
right.
that case been disposed of yet?
It has not. We've filed the lawsuit, but it's in discovery now. And what's all the more troubling is that she had a valid state ID that came back valid right at the very beginning, and still they held her, questioned her, took her to her home. Just terrible conduct. So
We're talking about cases that are really everyday cases, not for all of us, but they could be for all of us. And to my way of thinking, the American Civil Liberties Union, which is there to protect all of us and will take on cases where rights have been trampled, is one of the few protections that we have left. And you lead the legal team. So
for Minnesota, anyway, and we do
Minnesota,
our best.
yes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important work.
But you're all over the country.
Yes.
And really, I think we can rest a little easier knowing at least there's one organization out there that is trying to protect our rights, trying to uphold them under the Constitution. And we've been talking with Teresa Terry Nelson,
Thank you.
who is counsel to the Minnesota ACLU. And thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Good to see you.